I'm back in Lanchester now. Same old flat, same creaky kitchen chair. And every time I sit here, I remember the moment it all cracked open. It started with an email. Not from her, not even directly. It was a booking confirmation from a hotel in Phuket. The name under the reservation? Hers. But the second guest wasn't me. I had been staring at estate agent papers, trying to convince myself that a life in Thailand could actually work, that maybe love this late in life wasn't a joke. I was ready to commit, ready to uproot everything. But that email, it hit like a punch to the chest. My heart started racing. My hands went cold. I didn't even think. I just booked a flight for the next morning. No message, no warning. She'd told me everything was fine, but her voice had been distant lately. Her last message had just 3 lines. Missing you, Julian. Work is busy but good. Talk soon. No heart. No, can't wait. No mention of the waterfall trip we'd planned for weeks. That message haunted me, and I knew something was off. To everyone watching, if you've ever had that gut feeling something wasn't right, you're not crazy, listen to it. And if you're here right now, hit the like button, drop a comment, and let me know where in the world you're watching from. If you've been following my story, a super thank you honestly. Your support means more than you know. This one's hard to tell, because when I landed in Phuket, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. And in just one quiet moment, my world, our world, fell apart. But before I take you there, let me take you back to where it all started. I read it again, then again. The X at the end looked lonely, like an afterthought. Sopa never sent afterthoughts. She sent paragraphs about her day, photos of street food, voice messages where I could hear her laughing in the background. This wasn't her. Maybe she's just tired, I told myself, setting the phone face down on the kitchen table, but my hands were already shaking. I'd been back in the UK for 3 weeks, sorting out my late mother's house, dealing with solicitors and decades of accumulated junk. Sopa had been understanding about the delay. Too understanding, maybe. I picked up the phone again. The message was still there, still cold, still wrong. I scrolled up through our chat history. 2 days ago, she'd sent a selfie from the NGO office, smiling but not quite meeting the camera. 3 days before that, just good night, with no kisses. A week earlier, when I'd asked about her coordinator, Niran, she'd changed the subject entirely. The doubt crept in like water through a cracked foundation. I'd been so focused on settling Mum's affairs that I hadn't noticed the shift. Or maybe I had noticed, but chose not to see it. That's what men like me do, isn't it? We see what we need to see until we can't anymore. I opened my laptop and searched for flights to Phuket. The cursor blinked in the search box, while my heart hammered against my ribs. This was madness. She'd told me to take my time, that she understood family obligations. But something primal in my chest was screaming that time was exactly what I didn't have. Don't be ridiculous, Julian, I whispered to the empty kitchen. But my fingers were already typing dates, comparing prices, feeling that familiar surge of reckless hope that had brought me to Thailand in the first place. The kind of hope that makes sensible 50-year-old men abandon everything they know for the promise of something real. I found a flight leaving Manchester the next evening, direct to Bangkok, then a connection to Phuket. My finger hovered over the book now button while doubt and panic wrestled in my throat. What if I was wrong? What if she was just stressed with work? What if showing up unannounced made me look desperate and pathetic? But what if I was right? What if that cold little message was exactly what it felt like, a goodbye wrapped in politeness? I'd rather be wrong and embarrassed than right and too late. I clicked the button. The confirmation email arrived instantly, and with it a sick mixture of relief and terror. I was going back to Thailand. I was going back to her. And I had no idea what I'd find when I got there. That night, I lay in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by cardboard boxes and the ghosts of a life I'd already left behind. I kept checking my phone, hoping for another message from Sopa, something warmer, something that would make me cancel the flight and trust in what we'd built together. Nothing came. At 3 in the morning, I finally admitted to myself what I'd known the moment I read that message. Something had changed. Something was wrong. And I was about to fly halfway around the world to find out exactly how wrong it was. I met Sopa on a beach in Krabi during what should have been the loneliest period of my life. I'd been in Thailand for 6 months by then, running from a divorce that had left me feeling like a stranger in my own skin and an early retirement that felt more like exile than freedom. The dating apps back home were brutal for men my age, full of women who looked right through me or wanted someone's pension to subsidize their dreams. Thailand was supposed to be temporary, a place to lick my wounds and figure out what came next. I'd rented a little condo in Ao Nang, spent my days reading thriller novels and drinking too much beer, watching sunsets alone while younger travelers fell in love all around me. Then I saw the poster for the beach cleanup at the hotel lobby. Help save our ocean. Volunteer with Green Coast Foundation. There was a photo of smiling locals and tourists working together, and something about it made me feel less pathetic than usual. Maybe helping someone else would help me forget myself for a few hours. That's where I first saw her. Sopa was directing volunteers, her long black hair tied back in a practical ponytail, wearing a faded NGO t-shirt and shorts that had seen better days. She moved through the group with quiet authority, switching between Thai and English, making sure everyone had gloves and collection bags. When she smiled, her whole face changed, becoming luminous in a way that made the morning sun seem pale. "You're new," she said, walking over to where I stood, awkwardly holding a trash bag. Her English was nearly perfect, with just a hint of an accent that made everything sound more musical. "I'm Sopa." "Julian," I replied, suddenly aware that I hadn't shaved properly and my tourist shirt was already sweating through. "I'm staying in Ao Nang." "For how long?" There was genuine curiosity in her voice, not the practiced politeness I'd grown used to from service workers. "I honestly don't know," I said, and something about her made me add, "I'm kind of figuring that out as I go." She studied my face for a moment, and I had the strange feeling she could see more than I was saying. "Well, today you're here. That's what matters." She handed me a pointed stick for spearing litter. "Come on, Julian, who's figuring it out? Let's clean up this beach." We worked side by side for 3 hours, filling bags with plastic bottles and cigarette butts and the endless debris that the tide brings in. She told me about the foundation, how they worked with local communities to protect coral reefs and educate tourists about ocean conservation. I told her about my background in hotel management, how I'd seen too many beautiful places destroyed by careless development. "You understand," she said, pausing to wipe sweat from her forehead. "Most tourists, they see paradise and think it will always be there. They don't see the work it takes to keep it alive." When the cleanup finished, she invited me for lunch at a local place that served the best somtam I'd ever tasted. We talked for hours about everything and nothing, travel and books, and the strange ways life changes direction when you're not looking. She laughed easily and listened carefully, asking questions that made me remember parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. "Why Thailand?" she asked over mango sticky rice. I almost gave her the standard answer about adventure and new experiences. Instead, I found myself telling her the truth. I got divorced 2 years ago, lost my job to corporate restructuring, felt like everyone I knew was living lives that made sense while I was just existing. Thailand seemed far enough away to start over. "And is it?" she asked. "Far enough?" "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but today feels like the first day in months where I haven't felt completely lost." She reached across the table and touched my hand briefly. "Getting lost sometimes means you're looking for something better." That night, she showed me parts of Krabi that tourists never see. Night markets where vendors knew her by name, temples where monks blessed the evening prayers, viewpoints where the limestone cliffs caught the last light like ancient cathedrals. She moved through her world with such grace and purpose that I felt honored just to follow along. "I should get back," I finally said as we sat watching long-tail boats rock gently in the harbor. "Early flight to Phuket tomorrow." "Why Phuket?" she asked. "No particular reason, just the next place on my list." She was quiet for a moment, then said, The foundation has an office in Phuket. We could use someone with your experience, if you're interested. I looked at her profile in the lamplight, this remarkable woman who'd appeared in my life like an answer to a prayer I hadn't known I was saying. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a reason to stay in one place long enough to figure out what you're really looking for. 3 days later, I canceled my wandering plans and moved to Phuket. Within a week, Sopa was spending most nights at my condo. Within a month, I was helping fund her conservation projects and wondering how I'd gotten so lucky. She brought color back into a world that had gone gray, made me feel useful and needed and alive in ways I'd forgotten were possible. Looking back now, I can see how perfectly she played it. Never pushing too hard, never asking for too much at once. Just being there, being wonderful, being exactly what a lonely middle-aged man needed to believe in love again. But at the time, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. It felt like coming home. Even before I left for the UK, there were signs. Tiny fissures in our perfect life that I chose to ignore because acknowledging them would mean admitting that paradise might be temporary. I was 6 months into the relationship by then, completely besotted and willfully blind. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday morning in March. I woke up to find Sopa already dressed, checking her phone with an expression I'd never seen before. Focused, secretive. When she noticed me watching, the look vanished instantly, replaced by her familiar warm smile. "Good morning, handsome," she said, leaning down to kiss my forehead. "I have to leave early today. NGO emergency." "What kind of emergency?" I asked, still groggy but sensing something off in her tone. Coral bleaching report came in from one of our monitoring sites. Niran and I need to get out there before the tide changes. Niran. The coordinator she'd mentioned a few times but never elaborated on. I knew he was younger, dedicated to the cause, someone she worked closely with on field research. But something in the way she said his name made my chest tighten. "How long will you be gone?" 2 days, maybe 3. Depends what we find. She was already moving toward the door, gathering her dive gear and waterproof camera. "Don't wait up for me tonight, okay? We might camp on the boat to get early morning readings." She kissed me goodbye, but it felt hurried, distracted. I watched from the balcony as she loaded her gear into a truck I didn't recognize. There was a man in the driver's seat, but I couldn't see his face clearly through the windscreen glare. That night, I tried calling her. Straight to voicemail. The next day, the same. When she finally called back on the second evening, her voice sounded strange, distant. "The connection out here is terrible," she explained when I mentioned how far away she sounded. "We're in a really remote area. How's the coral situation?" "Bad, really bad. We might need to extend the trip another day." I wanted to ask more questions, but something in her tone warned me off. Instead, I said, "I miss you." "Miss you too," she replied, but it sounded automatic, like she was reading from a script. When she came home 3 days later, she was different. Still affectionate, still warm, but with a subtle distance that hadn't been there before. She showered immediately, unpacked her gear efficiently, and when I asked about the research findings, her answers were vague and technical. That night in bed, she turned toward me with sudden intensity, kissing me deeply, running her hands through my hair. "I'm so lucky to have you," she whispered against my neck. "You're my anchor, Julian. You keep me steady." The sex was passionate, almost desperate, like she was trying to prove something to both of us. Afterwards, she fell asleep curled against me, but I lay awake wondering why her words felt more like an apology than a declaration of love. The pattern repeated itself over the following weeks. Sudden work trips with Niran, phone calls that went straight to voicemail. Evenings when she came home emotionally distant, only to overcome that distance with physical intensity that left me confused and reassured in equal measure. I started noticing smaller things too. Her phone, which used to sit casually on the kitchen counter, was now always face down and within arm's reach. She'd developed a habit of stepping onto the balcony to take certain calls, speaking in rapid Thai that I couldn't follow. When I asked about work, her stories became increasingly generic. You're very secretive about your job lately, I said one morning over breakfast, trying to keep my tone light. She looked up from her papaya salad, and for just a moment I saw something flicker across her face. Guilt? Annoyance? Then her expression smoothed into practiced confusion. Secretive? I tell you everything. You used to tell me everything. Now when I ask about your trips with Niran, you just say research and change the subject. Because it's boring, Julian. Data collection and water samples and GPS coordinates. You don't really want to hear about turbidity measurements, do you? She was right, of course. The technical details were boring, but the way she dismissed my interest felt like a door closing. Before, she'd shared everything with enthusiastic detail, drawing diagrams on napkins and showing me photos from underwater cameras. Now her work had become a black box that I wasn't allowed to peer into. Maybe I could come along sometime, I suggested. Help with the documentation or equipment. Oh, honey, you'd hate it. Long, hot days on a cramped boat, sleeping in tents on beaches with no facilities. Besides, we need certified divers for most of the work. Every explanation made perfect sense individually. Together, they felt like a wall being built brick by brick. But every time I got close to voicing my concerns, she'd do something that made me feel foolish for doubting her. She'd cook my favorite pad Thai, or surprise me with tickets to a cultural show, or simply curl up next to me on the sofa and rest her head on my shoulder while we watched a movie. I love our quiet evenings together, she'd murmur. Just us, no work stress, no demands. You make everything peaceful, Julian. And I'd melt, feeling ashamed for questioning someone who clearly loved me, who'd chosen me over the dozens of younger, fitter, wealthier men who orbited around her at NGO events. I was being paranoid, I told myself, jealous and insecure like a teenager instead of a mature man who should trust the woman he loved. The night before I left for the UK, we made love with a tenderness that felt like goodbye. She traced patterns on my chest with her fingertip, her expression thoughtful and sad. I'll miss you so much, she said. Promise me you won't forget about us while you're dealing with family stuff. How could I forget about us? Sometimes when people go back to their old lives, they remember why they left the new one behind. Sopa, look at me. I tilted her chin up until her eyes met mine. You are my new life. Everything that matters to me is right here. She smiled then, but it was the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes, the kind that says goodbye even when the mouth is saying hello. I should have known then. Should have listened to the voice in my head that was screaming warnings instead of the voice in my heart that was singing love songs. But fear makes cowards of us all, and I was more afraid of losing her than I was of being lied to. So I got on the plane to Manchester, carrying her promises and my doubts in equal measure, not knowing that I was flying toward the end of everything I thought I knew about love. The plane lifted off from Manchester at sunset, and I pressed my face against the window watching England disappear beneath clouds and darkness. 13 hours to Bangkok, then another hour to Phuket. 15 hours to find out if I was running toward love or chasing a ghost. The businessman next to me was already asleep before we reached cruising altitude, his laptop still open to spreadsheets that meant nothing to me. I envied his certainty, his clear sense of purpose. I was flying back to Thailand based on nothing more than a feeling, a cold message, and the kind of gut instinct that had gotten me into trouble before. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through photos of Sopa and me from the last 6 months. There was one from our first beach cleanup together, both of us grinning and covered in sand and sweat. Another from a temple visit in Chiang Mai, her hands pressed together in prayer while I stood awkwardly beside her, trying to look respectful instead of completely out of place. One from last month, the two of us cooking together in my kitchen, her teaching me to make green curry while she laughed at my clumsy knife work. You hold it like you're afraid it's going to bite you, she'd said, covering my hands with hers to guide the motion. Cooking is about confidence, Julian. Trust yourself. Trust. The word felt heavy now, loaded with implications I hadn't wanted to examine. I'd trusted her completely, blindly, the way you trust someone when you need to believe they're real more than you need to protect yourself. The flight attendant offered me dinner, but my stomach was too knotted to accept. Instead, I closed my eyes and let myself remember the good times, the moments when our connection felt so natural and inevitable that I couldn't imagine how I'd lived without her. Like the night she got food poisoning from street vendor satay and spent 3 hours being sick while I held her hair back and brought her water and paracetamol. Most women I'd known would have been embarrassed, would have tried to hide their vulnerability. But Sopa had just looked up at me with grateful eyes and said, "Thank you for taking care of me. I'm not used to having someone who stays." Or the morning I'd woken up to find her on the balcony at dawn, still in my t-shirt, sketching the sunrise over the Andaman Sea. She'd been so absorbed in her drawing that she hadn't heard me approach. I'd stood there watching her work, struck by how beautiful she looked in the early light, how perfectly she seemed to belong in my life. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" she'd ask when she noticed me. "Just how lucky I am," I'd said, and meant it completely. "Lucky how?" "Lucky that you decided to love an old fool like me." She'd set down her sketch pad then, and pulled me down beside her, curling into my arms as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. "You're not old, Julian. You're seasoned. Like good whiskey or aged cheese." She'd grinned at her own analogy. "And you're definitely not a fool. A fool wouldn't have given up his comfortable life to chase something uncertain. Maybe that's exactly what makes me a fool." "No," she'd said, serious now. "That makes you brave." Brave. I hadn't felt brave boarding this flight. I felt desperate and pathetic and terrified of what I might find. But maybe Sopa had seen something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Maybe that's what love was supposed to do. Reflect back our better angels until we started believing in them. The plane droned on through the darkness while other passengers slept around me. I tried to doze, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that cold message again. "Missing you, Julian. Work is busy but good. Talk soon. X." 7 words that had upended everything I thought I knew about us. What if I was wrong? What if she really was just busy with work, stressed about some environmental crisis I didn't understand? What if showing up unannounced would destroy something precious through suspicion and paranoia? But what if I was right? What if that message was exactly what it felt like? A goodbye wrapped in politeness. What if Niran wasn't just a work colleague but something more? What if all those overnight research trips and face-down phones and distant looks were adding up to a truth I'd been too afraid to see? I must have finally dozed because suddenly the flight attendant was shaking my shoulder and announcing our descent into Bangkok. The city sprawled below us, a grid of lights in the tropical darkness, foreign and familiar at the same time. This was where I'd first landed 8 months ago, running from a life that no longer fit. Now I was coming back to find out if the new life I'd built was real or just another beautiful illusion. The connection to Phuket was delayed by an hour. Mechanical problems, they said, which gave me time to pace the terminal and check my phone obsessively. Still, nothing from Sopa. I'd been traveling for nearly 24 hours, and she had no idea I was coming. For all she knew, I was still in my mother's empty house in Lancashire, sorting through decades of accumulated memories. When we finally boarded the small plane to Phuket, I felt my heart rate spike with every mile we covered. The island appeared below us like a green jewel in the blue-black sea, the same view that had taken my breath away the first time I'd seen it. But now it looked different somehow, less like paradise and more like a question mark, beautiful and uncertain and possibly dangerous. The plane touched down and I gathered my small carry-on bag, everything I owned in the world fitting into one piece of luggage. That should have felt liberating, I suppose. But instead, it felt precarious, like I was one revelation away from having nothing at all. I caught a taxi at the airport, giving the driver the address of the house Sopa and I shared in Rawai. My house, technically, since I'd been paying the rent, but it had become our home, the place where we'd built something that felt real and permanent and worth protecting. "You know this area well?" the driver asked in broken English. "I live there," I said, then corrected myself. "I used to live there. I do live there. I'm just coming back from a trip." He nodded politely, probably used to confused foreigners who couldn't keep their stories straight. Through the taxi window, I watched familiar landmarks slide past in the darkness. the night market where Sopa bought our vegetables, the temple where we'd attended a festival last month, the beach where she taught me to identify different types of coral by their shapes and colors. Every memory felt precious and fragile now, like soap bubbles that might pop if I examined them too closely. In an hour, I'd know whether they were real or just beautiful lies. In an hour, my life would either return to normal or shatter into pieces I'd never be able to put back together. The taxi pulled up outside the house, and I sat for a moment, staring at the familiar green gate and the frangipani tree we'd planted together. There was a light on in the living room. She was home. I paid the driver and stood on the sidewalk with my bag, looking up at the windows of the life I'd thought I was living. Whatever happened next would change everything. I just hoped I was strong enough to survive the truth. The gate creaked as I pushed it open, the same sound it had made every day for 6 months, but now it felt ominous, like a warning. I could hear music playing from inside the house, something Thai and melodic that drifted through the windows along with the warm glow of lamplight. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it, except for the motorcycle parked under the carport where my rental scooter used to sit. It was a nice bike, newer than anything Sopa could afford on her NGO salary. Black and chrome with racing stripes, the kind young Thai men rode to impress girls and show off their success. My stomach dropped as I stared at it, trying to find an innocent explanation and failing completely. I walked up the familiar path to our front door, my key ready in my hand, then stopped. Something felt wrong about using my key, about walking into what might not be my home anymore without warning. Instead, I knocked. 3 soft raps that sounded pathetically tentative in the evening air. The music didn't stop, but I heard movement inside. Footsteps, voices speaking in rapid Thai. Then silence. I knocked again, louder this time. "Sopa, it's me, it's Julian." More silence. But I could feel someone on the other side of the door, listening, deciding. The light was still on, the music still playing. She was definitely home. "Sopa?" I called again. "I know you're there. I can see the light." Finally, her voice came through the door, muffled and strange. "Julian, what are you doing here?" "I live here," I said, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. "I came back early. Are you going to let me in?" Give me a minute. I need to." Her voice faded as she moved away from the door. I stood there in the humid evening air, listening to movement inside that sounded like rushing, like hiding, like preparation for something I wasn't supposed to see. My heart hammered against my ribs as the minutes ticked by. Through the thin walls I heard hushed conversation in Thai, urgent and worried. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened a crack and Sopa's face appeared. She looked beautiful as always, but there was something in her expression I'd never seen before. Panic, maybe, or guilt. "Hi," she said, not opening the door wider. "This is a surprise. Can I come in? It's my house, Sopa." Of course, I wasn't expecting you. The place is a mess." She stepped back reluctantly, opening the door just enough for me to slip through. The living room looked fine to me, no messier than usual, but there were 2 glasses on the coffee table where there should have been 1, 2 dinner plates on the kitchen counter, and something else, something that made my blood freeze in my veins. A man's shirt draped over the back of our sofa. Not mine. "Whose shirt is that?" I asked, my voice coming out strangled and small. Sopa followed my gaze, and I watched her face cycle through emotions: surprise, calculation, resignation. Then she composed herself with the skill of someone who'd had practice. "Oh, that's Niran's. He came by earlier to drop off some research data. Must have forgotten it. He was here? In our house? It's not unusual, Julian. We work together. Sometimes we need to review materials here because the office computer is so slow." Every word sounded reasonable. Every explanation made sense. But my body knew what my mind was trying to deny. The air in the room felt charged with recent intimacy, with secrets and lies and things that shouldn't have been happening in the home I'd paid for. Where is he now? I asked. He left hours ago, right after we finished going through the coral bleaching data. I looked around the room more carefully now, seeing details I'd missed before. The sofa cushions were rumpled in a way that suggested two people, not one. There was a wine bottle on the counter, nearly empty, with two glasses beside it, and something else that made my chest tighten with recognition and revulsion. The playlist that was still softly playing was the same one Sopa and I listened to when we made love. The same Thai indie songs, in the same order, that had become the soundtrack to our most intimate moments. Julian? Her voice sounded far away, concerned. Are you okay? You look pale. I need some air, I managed, walking past her toward the back door. I need to sit down. I stumbled out to the small garden we'd created together, the space where we'd planted herbs and flowers and talked about the future. The plastic chairs where we'd shared morning coffee and evening beers were still there, but they felt like furniture from someone else's life. Sopa followed me outside, her movements careful and controlled. Julian, what's wrong? Talk to me. That motorcycle, I said without looking at her. Under the carport. Whose is it? A pause that lasted too long. It's Niran's. I told you he was here earlier, but he left hours ago. He walked to the bus stop, said the exercise would be good for him. Another reasonable explanation, another story that fit the facts but felt wrong in every fiber of my being. I turned to face her and saw her watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Not love, not guilt, just careful attention, like she was measuring my reactions and planning her next move. Sopa, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Tell me the truth. I am telling you the truth. Then why won't you look me in the eyes when you say it? She met my gaze then, and for a moment I saw something flicker there. Not confession, but something harder. Annoyance, maybe, that I was asking questions she didn't want to answer. I think you're jet-lagged, she said finally, and maybe a little paranoid. You've been under a lot of stress with your mother's house. Don't, I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. Don't make this about stress or jet lag or anything except what's happening right here, right now. We stared at each other, in the garden we'd planted together, surrounded by the flowers we'd watered and the dreams we'd shared. I could see her making calculations behind her eyes, deciding how much truth she could afford to tell and how much she could get away with hiding. Finally, she sighed and sat down in the chair that had become mine over the months of shared mornings. Julian, you have to trust me. There's nothing going on that threatens what we have. Then where is he? What? Niran. If he left hours ago, where is he? Because that bike hasn't moved. I can tell by the way the dew settled on the seat. I hadn't even realized I'd noticed that detail until I said it, but it was true. The motorcycle seat was beaded with moisture that takes time to accumulate. It had been parked there all night. Sopa's face went through another series of micro-expressions, and I realized I was watching someone very skilled at deception being caught off guard. She opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked uncertain. That uncertainty told me everything I needed to know. I stood up slowly, feeling like an old man, feeling like someone whose life had just become a different story than the one he thought he was living. I'm going to get a hotel room for tonight, I said. Give you some space to figure out what you want to tell me. Julian, wait. No. The word came out sharper than I intended. I've been waiting for 3 weeks while your messages got colder and colder. I've been waiting since I walked in here and saw another man's shirt on our sofa. I'm done waiting. I walked back into the house to collect my bag, and as I did, I heard a sound from the bedroom that made my blood turn to ice. A soft thud, like someone trying to move quietly and accidentally bumping into furniture. Sopa heard it too. I could tell by the way her whole body went rigid, by the way her breathing stopped for just a moment too long. Julian, she said, her voice taking on a pleading quality I'd never heard before. Please don't. But I was already walking toward the bedroom, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I pushed open the door I'd walked through 1,000 times before and found myself staring at a room that was exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. The bathroom door was closed. The bathroom door that we never closed unless someone was inside it. I looked back at Sopa, who was standing in the bedroom doorway with tears in her eyes. Not tears of sadness, I realized. Tears of frustration, of being caught. "How long?" I asked. She didn't answer. "How long, Sopa? It's not what you think. How long have you been fucking him in my bed?" The crude words felt foreign in my mouth, but they cut through all her careful explanations and reasonable stories. She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "Julian, please." "How long?" I shouted, and heard movement from behind the bathroom door. Someone else's shock at my voice. Someone else's fear of discovery. Sopa looked at me then with something I'd never seen in her eyes before. Not love, not guilt, not even regret. Just cold calculation, like she was deciding whether to keep lying or cut her losses. 3 weeks, she said quietly, since the day after you left for England. The truth hit me like a physical blow, driving the air out of my lungs and leaving me gasping. 3 weeks. The entire time I'd been missing her, worrying about her, rushing back to save what we had, she'd been here with him. In my bed, in my house, with my money paying for their cozy little love nest. I grabbed my bag and walked toward the door, past Sopa, who didn't try to stop me. As I reached the front door, I heard the bathroom open and soft footsteps on the wooden floor. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see his face. Didn't want to give her the satisfaction of watching me confront the man who'd been living my life while I was gone. "Julian," she called after me as I walked down the path. "Where will you go?" I stopped at the gate and looked back at her, standing in the doorway of the house I'd thought was our home, lit from behind by the warm light of the life I'd thought we were building together. "I don't know," I said, "but wherever it is, it'll be honest." I walked away into the humid night air, pulling my phone out to search for nearby hotels. The screen blurred as tears finally came, hot and angry and long overdue. Behind me, I heard the front door close with a soft click that sounded like the end of everything I'd believed about love. I spent the night in a budget hotel near Patong Beach, the kind of place where the air conditioning wheezed and the walls were thin enough to hear every conversation in adjacent rooms. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat on the narrow bed staring at my phone, cycling between rage and heartbreak and a numb disbelief that made the whole evening feel like someone else's nightmare. At sunrise, I gave up pretending I might rest and walked down to the beach. Patong in the early morning was a different world from the neon chaos of night. Street vendors were setting up their stalls, joggers moved along the sand in peaceful silence, and the Andaman Sea stretched endlessly toward the horizon, indifferent to human suffering. I found a coffee cart and bought the strongest brew the elderly Thai woman could make, then sat on the seawall watching the sun climb higher. My phone buzzed with messages from Sopa. 3 of them, each more desperate than the last. "Julian, please come back so we can talk. You don't understand the whole situation. I never meant for this to happen. You have to believe me." I didn't reply. What was there to say? That I understood perfectly? That sleeping with another man for 3 weeks while your boyfriend was settling his dead mother's affairs was the kind of situation that explained itself? Around 9 in the morning, I decided to go back to the house, not to reconcile, not to listen to more explanations, but to collect my things and figure out what came next. I'd paid rent through the end of the month, but I couldn't imagine sleeping in that bed again, eating at that table, pretending the walls hadn't witnessed my complete humiliation. The motorcycle was gone from the carport when I arrived, which felt like a small mercy. I let myself in with my key, calling out to make sure Sopa was awake before I started packing. "Julian?" Her voice came from the kitchen. "Is that you?" I found her making coffee, still in the oversized t-shirt she'd worn to bed. My t-shirt, I realized with a sick twist of irony. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes that might have been from crying or might have been from lack of sleep. "I'm just here to get my things," I said before she could speak. "I'll be out of your way in an hour." "Our things," she corrected softly. "This is still your home too." No, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. It stopped being my home the moment you brought him into our bed. She flinched at that, but didn't deny it. Julian, if you'd just let me explain. Explain what? How you've been lying to me for weeks. How every time I called and you sounded distant, it was because he was there. How you've been playing house with another man while I was burying my mother. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like, Sopa? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like that. She set down her coffee mug with shaking hands and turned to face me fully. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked her age. Young and uncertain, and caught in something bigger than she could handle. Niran and I have history, she said quietly. We dated before I met you. When you left for England, he came by to check on me, and you fell back into bed with him. It wasn't planned, it just happened. I laughed, and the sound was harsh even to my own ears. It just happened for 3 weeks. It just happened every night while you were texting me about missing me and counting the days until I came home. I do miss you. I was counting the days. While fucking your ex-boyfriend in my bed. Stop saying that. Why? Because it's crude? Because it makes you uncomfortable? Good. You should be uncomfortable. You should be ashamed. Tears were streaming down her face now, but they looked more like frustration than remorse. You don't understand what it's like being alone here, Julian. You have your visa, your money, your freedom to come and go. I have responsibilities, community expectations, family pressure. When you left, everyone started asking questions about our relationship, about whether you were serious or just playing with me. So, you decided to hedge your bets? I decided to protect myself. The honesty of it hit me harder than any lie could have. She wasn't denying it, wasn't making excuses. She was telling me exactly what I'd been to her, a temporary arrangement with an expiration date she'd seen coming long before I had. How long have you been planning this? I asked. Planning what? This conversation? This breakup? How long have you known that what we had wasn't real? She looked away, staring out the kitchen window at the garden we'd planted together. I tried to make it real, Julian. I really did. But we're from different worlds, different ages, different cultures, different expectations about what love means. Love means not sleeping with other people. Love means different things to different people in different situations. I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. This wasn't heartbreak anymore, it was recognition. The woman standing in front of me wasn't the person I'd fallen in love with. Maybe she'd never been that person. Maybe I'd built an entire relationship with someone who existed only in my imagination. You're right, I said quietly. We are from different worlds. In my world, when someone says they love you, it means something. In your world, apparently it's just something you say to keep the rent paid. That got a reaction. Her head snapped up and her eyes flashed with something I'd never seen before. Not hurt, not guilt. Anger. Don't you dare, she said, her voice low and dangerous. Don't you dare reduce what we had to a financial transaction. Then what was it, Sopa? Because I'm looking at the evidence, and it's pretty damning. Foreign man with pension income meets beautiful local girl with NGO job that doesn't pay enough to live on. Girl moves in with foreign man, lets him pay for everything, makes him feel needed and important. Foreign man leaves town for a few weeks. Girl immediately starts sleeping with someone else. Foreign man comes back unexpectedly and discovers he was never anything more than a convenient arrangement. That's not true. Which part? The part about me paying for everything? The part about you sleeping with Niran the moment I left? Or the part about this whole relationship being a lie? She didn't answer, which was answer enough. I walked past her toward the bedroom to start packing, but her voice stopped me in the doorway. I did love you, Julian. Maybe not the way you wanted me to, but I did love you. I turned back to look at her one more time. She was still beautiful, still the woman who'd made me believe in second chances and tropical dreams. But now, I could see through the beauty to something harder underneath, something calculating and self-protective that had been there all along. No, I said. You loved what I represented. security, freedom, escape from whatever life you were living before. But you never loved me. If you had, you couldn't have done this. You're wrong. Am I? Because the woman I thought I loved would have ended things cleanly instead of cheating. Would have been honest about her feelings instead of stringing me along. Would have shown some guilt or shame or regret, instead of standing there trying to justify betrayal as cultural difference. I saw her face change then, saw the last pretense of remorse fall away and reveal what had been hiding underneath all along: cold pragmatism. The look of someone who'd been caught but wasn't particularly sorry about what they'd been caught doing. What do you want me to say, Julian? That I'm sorry? Fine, I'm sorry. That I made a mistake? Fine, I made a mistake. But I'm 28 years old, and you're almost 50. Did you really think this was going to last forever? There it was. The truth at last, delivered without a trace of kindness or consideration for how it might land. I felt something break inside my chest. Not my heart this time, but something deeper. My faith in my own judgment, maybe. My belief that I could read people and situations and trust what I saw. No, I said quietly. I thought it would last until you got tired of pretending to love me. I just didn't expect it to happen quite so soon. She had the grace to look away at that, but she didn't take it back, didn't soften it or try to cushion the blow. Just stood there in my t-shirt in the kitchen of the home I'd been paying for, letting me absorb the full weight of my own foolishness. I went into the bedroom and packed my few belongings into the same bag I'd carried from England. Everything I owned in Thailand fit easily into one piece of luggage, which should have felt liberating but instead felt pathetic. 6 months of life reduced to a carry-on bag and a broken heart. When I came back through the kitchen, Sopa was still standing by the window. She didn't turn around, didn't say goodbye, didn't offer any final words of regret or explanation. Just stood there like a statue while I walked out of her life for the second and final time. I paused at the front door, looking back at the house that had briefly been home. The frangipani tree we'd planted together was blooming, white flowers scattered on the ground like discarded promises. The morning sun slanted through the windows, illuminating the space where we'd cooked together and laughed together and made love with what I'd thought was genuine tenderness. None of it had been real. Not the tree, not the laughter, not the tenderness. Just an elaborate performance designed to keep me paying rent and feeling grateful for the privilege. I pulled the door closed behind me and dropped my key through the mail slot, listening to it land on the tiles with a final metallic clink. The motorcycle was back in the carport. Niran had returned while we were talking, probably waiting somewhere nearby until he was sure I was gone. I wondered if they'd discussed me, if they'd laughed about the stupid Farang who thought a beautiful young woman could actually love him, if they'd planned exactly how to handle my unexpected return. I walked to the main road and flagged down a songthu, climbing into the back with my bag and my demolished illusions. As the truck pulled away, I caught a glimpse of Sopa in the kitchen window, no longer alone. Niran was behind her, his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder as they watched me disappear. She didn't look sad. She didn't look guilty. She looked relieved. Like a burden had finally been lifted from her shoulders, like she could stop pretending to be someone she wasn't and go back to living her real life with her real boyfriend. I was just a chapter she was ready to close, and she hadn't even flinched when she turned the page. I checked into a different hotel this time, something mid-range near Kata Beach where I could afford to stay for a week while I figured out what came next. The room was clean and anonymous, with a view of other hotels and the kind of generic furniture that could have been anywhere in the world. It felt appropriate somehow, this featureless space that demanded nothing and promised less. I set my bag on the bed and sat down beside it, suddenly exhausted despite having done nothing but walk away from my life. The air conditioning hummed steadily, drowning out the sounds of traffic and tourists that drifted up from the street. For the first time in 24 hours, I was completely alone with what had happened. The tears came then, not the angry tears from the night before, but something deeper and more devastating. 6 months of my life, gone. Not just the relationship, but the version of myself that had believed in it. The Julian who'd thought he was building something permanent, something worth the risk of opening his heart again after divorce and loneliness, had nearly destroyed him. I cried for the mornings we'd shared coffee on the balcony, for the evenings we'd cooked together while rain drummed on the roof, for the nights we'd made love with what I'd thought was mutual tenderness and joy. All of it had been performance on her part, a job she'd done well enough to fool a lonely, middle-aged man who'd wanted to believe in second chances. When the tears stopped, I was left with something worse than sadness. Shame, not just at being deceived, but at how completely I'd deceived myself. The signs had been there. I could see that now. The phone always face down, the work trips that made no sense, the gradual cooling in her messages, the way she'd use intimacy to deflect my questions instead of answering them honestly. I'd ignored it all because I'd needed to believe that someone like Sopa could love someone like me. A 49-year-old divorced hotel manager with thinning hair and a pension that represented security but not excitement. I'd been so grateful for her attention that I'd convinced myself it was real, even when every instinct I possessed was screaming warnings. My phone buzzed with another message from her. "Julian, please answer me. We need to talk about practical things, the rent, the utilities, your belongings." Practical things. Of course. Even her attempts at reconciliation were transactional. I typed back, "Keep whatever's there. Consider it payment for services rendered." The reply came immediately, "Don't be cruel. That's not who you are." But maybe it was who I was. Maybe the kind, generous Julian who'd fallen for her act had been as fake as her love. Maybe underneath all the romantic gestures and emotional openness was just another bitter expat who'd learned too late that money couldn't buy genuine affection. I turned off the phone and walked to the small balcony, looking out over Kata Beach where couples walked hand in hand along the sand. Young couples mostly, backpackers and honeymooners who moved together with the easy synchronization of people whose feelings matched their circumstances. I envied their certainty, their ability to trust what they felt without questioning whether it was real. The minibar caught my attention when I went back inside. A small selection of overpriced alcohol that suddenly seemed like exactly what I needed. I opened a tiny bottle of whiskey and drank it straight, feeling the burn in my throat and the spreading warmth in my chest. Then another. Then a third. The alcohol didn't make me feel better, but it made me feel different. Less sharp, less focused on the specific details of my humiliation. I could almost pretend I was just another tourist having a quiet evening alone, someone between adventures, rather than someone whose adventure had ended in spectacular failure. I must have dozed because I woke up hours later to the sound of my phone buzzing insistently, multiple missed calls from Sopa, and a string of messages that grew increasingly desperate. "Julian, I know you're angry, but please call me back. I need to know you're okay. The neighbors are asking questions. I don't know what to tell them. This isn't how I wanted things to end." I stared at the messages for a long time, trying to decode what she was really asking for. Not forgiveness, I didn't think. Not even reconciliation. She wanted something from me, some response or reaction that would make this easier for her to process. Maybe she needed me to fight for her, to beg her to choose me over Niran so she could feel better about rejecting me. Or maybe she needed me to forgive her so she could convince herself she wasn't really the villain in this story. I gave her neither. Instead, I typed, "Was any of it real?" 3 dots appeared immediately, showing that she was typing a response. Then they disappeared, then appeared again. This went on for several minutes, her starting and stopping and starting again, unable to find words that would satisfy both honesty and kindness. Finally, "Some of it." 2 words that somehow hurt more than all her explanations and justifications combined. Some of it. Which parts? The laughter? The tenderness? The quiet moments when she'd rest her head on my shoulder and tell me I made her feel safe? Or just the parts where I was useful, where I provided something she needed and couldn't get elsewhere? I didn't ask for clarification. I didn't want to know which parts of my happiest memories were real and which were elaborate lies. Instead, I turned off the phone again and sat in the darkness, listening to the air conditioning hum and the distant sound of waves against the shore. The next few days blurred together in a haze of room service meals and mindless television. I ordered food I didn't taste, watched Thai soap operas I didn't understand, and slept more hours than any healthy person should. The hotel staff began to look at me with the polite concern reserved for guests who might be having some kind of breakdown. "Everything okay, sir?" the housekeeping woman asked when she found me still in bed at 2 in the afternoon, surrounded by empty minibar bottles and plates of half-eaten food. "Fine," I said, though we both knew it was a lie. "Just tired." She nodded and went about her work, changing sheets and emptying trash with the efficient kindness of someone who'd seen this before. Broken-hearted tourists were probably a regular feature of her job, men and women who'd come to Thailand looking for something and found more than they'd bargained for. On the 4th day, I forced myself to shower and leave the room. Not because I felt better, but because the walls were starting to close in, and I could feel myself disappearing into a depression that might be hard to climb out of. I walked down to Kata Beach and sat on the sand, watching the sun set over the Andaman Sea in shades of gold and pink that reminded me painfully of mornings on the balcony with Sopa. A couple walked past me, laughing and taking selfies as the light faded. They looked happy, uncomplicated, secure in whatever they'd found together. I watched them until they disappeared around a rocky outcrop, wondering if what they had was real or if they were just better at maintaining their illusions than I had been. My phone buzzed. Another message from Sopa, the first in 2 days. "I saw Mrs. Kamala at the market. She asked about you. I told her you went back to England. I hope that's okay." I stared at the message for a long time. Mrs. Kamala was our elderly neighbor who'd always smiled and waved when she saw us working in the garden together. She'd probably approved of our relationship, maybe even envied it. A nice foreign man taking care of a local girl, both of them building something stable and sweet in her neighborhood. Now she'd think I'd abandoned Sopa, that I was just another Western man who'd used a Thai woman and moved on when he got bored. The irony was bitter enough to taste. I typed back, "Tell her whatever you want. It doesn't matter anymore." But it did matter, I realized as soon as I sent the message. It mattered because my reputation was part of who I'd thought I was in Thailand. The good guy, the one who was different from all the other Western men who came looking for easy relationships and cheap thrills. I'd prided myself on being genuine, on building something real with someone I respected. Now I was just another casualty of my own naivety, another middle-aged fool who'd confused gratitude for love and financial dependence for emotional connection. The story would spread through the expatriate community like all stories did in small places. Julian, who got played by his young girlfriend. Julian, who flew back from England to find her with someone else. Julian, who was too proud or too hurt to fight for her. I finished watching the sunset alone, then walked back to the hotel through streets that had once felt welcoming and now felt merely foreign. Tomorrow, I decided, I would start figuring out what came next. Tonight, I would order room service and finish the job the minibar had started. But first, I had one more message to send. "Thank you for teaching me something important about myself," I typed. "I'm not as smart as I thought I was, but I'm stronger than I expected to be." I hit send before I could change my mind, then turned off the phone for the last time. Whatever she replied, if she replied at all, I didn't need to know. I was done seeking answers from someone who'd already given me the only one that mattered. Some of it was real, just not the parts that would have made the difference. On my 6th morning in the hotel, I woke up with something approaching clarity for the first time since I'd knocked on the door that wouldn't open. Not happiness, not acceptance, but a kind of grim purposefulness that felt like the first step back toward being human again. I showered, put on clean clothes, and decided to do something I'd been avoiding since this whole nightmare began. I wanted to see where Sopa worked, not to confront her, not to make some grand gesture of forgiveness or revenge, but to understand something about the life she'd been living parallel to ours. The professional Sopa who led beach cleanups and fought for coral conservation, who'd seemed so passionate about her work that I'd never questioned whether it was real or just another performance. The Green Coast Foundation office was in a converted shophouse in Phuket town, wedged between a pharmacy and a shop selling Buddhist amulets. I'd dropped Sopa off here a few times but never gone inside, respecting her desire to keep work and personal life separate. Now I realized that separation might have been less about professional boundaries and more about maintaining the illusion that she was the dedicated environmentalist I'd fallen in love with. The front office was small but busy, with volunteers stuffing envelopes and updating databases, while Thai pop music played softly in the background. Posters covered the walls showing before and after photos of restored coral reefs and groups of smiling volunteers holding bags of collected beach trash. It looked legitimate, purposeful, exactly the kind of organization someone like Sopa should work for. The receptionist looked up as I entered, a young Thai woman with the kind of cheerful efficiency that suggested genuine commitment to the cause. Her smile faltered slightly when she saw me, and I realized she knew who I was. "Good morning," I said in English, not trusting my minimal Thai for this conversation. "I'm Julian. I was Sopa's boyfriend." "Oh," she said, her expression cycling through recognition, sympathy, and something that looked uncomfortably like pity. "Hello, Mr. Julian. I'm Ploy. We met briefly at the fundraising dinner last month." I remembered her now, one of several staff members Sopa had introduced me to during an evening that had felt like a validation of our relationship. Look, her presence beside me had seemed to say, "I'm serious enough about this man to bring him into my professional world." "Is Sopa here?" I asked, though I hoped she wasn't. I didn't want another confrontation, another round of explanations and justifications that would leave us both feeling worse. "No, she called in sick today, and yesterday." Ploy's expression suggested she knew exactly why Sopa wasn't coming to work. "I see. Well, I was actually hoping to talk to someone about volunteering. I have some free time and I'd like to help with your conservation work." It was a lie, of course. I had no intention of staying in Thailand long enough to volunteer for anything, but I needed a reason to be there that didn't involve my destroyed relationship, and environmental conservation was something I genuinely cared about during my time with Sopa. Ploy brightened at this, perhaps relieved to move to safer conversational ground. "That's wonderful. We always need experienced volunteers, especially ones with organizational skills. Let me get you some information packets." She bustled around gathering brochures and application forms while I pretended to study the wall posters. The work looked real, important even. Photos of healthy coral reefs and clean beaches, testimonials from local fishermen about improved water quality, statistics about plastic waste reduction that seemed substantial and verifiable. "Here you go," Ploy said, returning with a thick folder. "These explain our current projects and volunteer opportunities. There's also information about our funding sources and partnership organizations." I accepted the folder and flipped through it politely, noting the impressive list of international donors and the detailed financial reports that suggested transparency and accountability. Whatever else Sopa might have been lying about, her job appeared to be legitimate. "This looks excellent," I said. "Very professional. You must be proud of what you've accomplished here." "We are," Ploy agreed, then hesitated. "Mr. Julian, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you really planning to volunteer, or are you trying to understand something about Sopa?" Her directness caught me off guard, but I appreciated it. Better honest awkwardness than polite pretense. "A little of both, I suppose," I admitted. Things ended badly between us. I'm trying to figure out what was real and what wasn't." Ploy nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I liked working with Sopa," she said carefully. "She's smart and dedicated, and she really does care about marine conservation, but she also cares about other things. Security, stability, having options." Ploy looked around the office nervously, as if worried about being overheard. "I shouldn't be telling you this. You don't have to tell me anything. It's just, you weren't the first, Mr. Julian. Sopa is very good at making people feel special, making them want to help her and the foundation. But she keeps her professional relationships and her personal relationships very separate, if you know what I mean. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. How many were there? I don't know exact numbers, but in the 3 years I've worked here, there have been several Western men who were very generous with donations, very supportive of SOPA's work. They usually lasted 6 months to a year. And then they would stop coming around. Sometimes they'd send angry emails asking for their money back or demanding to know what happened to projects they'd funded. We'd explain that the work continued, that their contributions had been used properly, but that SOPA was no longer available for personal meetings. I opened the folder she'd given me and looked more closely at the financial reports. The numbers were impressive, with individual donations ranging from a few $100s to several thousand. More than most environmental NGOs could expect from casual supporters. The money always went to legitimate projects, I asked. Always. SOPA was very careful about that. She never stole anything, never misrepresented how funds were used. She just found donors who were personally motivated to support her work. Personally motivated, a euphemism that covered a multitude of sins while technically staying within legal and ethical boundaries. SOPA had been running what amounted to a long-term fundraising operation, using genuine environmental work as the foundation for relationships that generated real benefits for the organization, while providing her with financial security and romantic options. I donated about £8,000 over 6 months, I said quietly, to various projects she told me about. The Coral Restoration Program and the Plastic Waste Education Initiative, Ploy said immediately. Yes, those were real projects that achieved measurable results. Your money helped build an artificial reef that's already showing signs of marine life recovery and funded educational materials that we've distributed to 15 schools. It should have been comforting to know that my money had accomplished something worthwhile, but instead it felt like another betrayal. She'd used my genuine desire to help as a tool for manipulation, taking advantage of my concern for the environment to extract funds that supported both her cause and her lifestyle. Does she love any of them? I asked, hating how pathetic the question sounded. Ploy's expression softened. I think she tries to, Mr. Julian. I think she tells herself that the feelings are real, at least while they last. But she's also very practical about relationships. She grew up poor, in a family with no safety net. She learned early that emotional security and financial security often go together. And Naren? Her boyfriend since university. He works for another environmental organization, makes very little money, but he's her age and from her background. I think with him, she can be herself in ways she can't with Western men who expect her to be grateful for their attention. The brutal honesty of it was oddly liberating, not because it made me feel better about being used, but because it finally gave me a complete picture of what I'd been involved in. SOPA wasn't evil, wasn't even unusually manipulative by the standards of people trying to survive in difficult circumstances. She was just someone who'd figured out how to use her advantages to create stability in an unstable world. Thank you for being honest with me, I said, closing the folder. I know you didn't have to tell me any of this. I liked you, Ploy said simply. You were always kind to the staff, always interested in the actual work we were doing. Some of SOPA's friends only wanted to talk about her. I left the NGO office with a strange sense of closure. Not because I'd gotten the answers I'd hoped for, but because I'd finally gotten the truth. SOPA had been exactly what she'd appeared to be, a dedicated environmental advocate who was also skilled at mixing professional and personal relationships in ways that benefited everyone involved, at least in the short term. The tragedy wasn't that she'd deceived me, but that I'd deceived myself about what I meant to her. I'd wanted to be special, to be different from the other middle-aged Western men who'd passed through her life. Instead, I'd been exactly like them, just another well-meaning donor who'd confused charity with love and gratitude with genuine affection. But at least my money had built an artificial reef. At least some good had come from my delusions. That would have to be enough. The lawyer's office was in the same building as 3 other law firms, a concrete tower in Phuket town where expatriates went to sort out visa problems and property disputes. I'd found Mr. Somchai through a recommendation from the hotel concierge who'd recognized the look of a foreigner dealing with relationship complications and handed me a business card with practiced sympathy. "These things happen more than you'd think," she'd said diplomatically. "Mr. Somchai is very experienced with international relationship issues." International relationship issues. A polite way of saying foreign men getting screwed over by local women, or foreign women getting screwed over by local men, or any of the dozen variations on cross-cultural romance gone wrong that probably kept lawyers like Mr. Somchai busy year-round. His office was small but professional, with diplomas in Thai and English hanging on the walls and a bookshelf full of legal codes that looked well used. Mr. Somchai himself was in his 50s, with the careful manner of someone who'd heard every sob story and seen every type of exploitation that international love could produce. "Please sit down, Mr. Morrison," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "Tell me how I can help you." I'd rehearsed this conversation in my head, trying to find a way to explain my situation without sounding completely pathetic. "I've been in a relationship with a Thai woman for 6 months. I've been supporting her financially, and I'm wondering what legal recourse I might have to recover some of the money I've spent." Mr. Somchai nodded, making notes on a yellow legal pad. "What kind of financial support are we discussing?" "Rent for an apartment, utilities, groceries, cash for her NGO work, plus some larger donations to environmental projects she was involved with, probably £15,000 total. And you have documentation of these expenditures?" I pulled out my phone and showed him photos I'd taken of bank transfer receipts, rental agreements, and donation confirmations. "Most of it, yes. The rent was paid from my UK bank account. The donations were made through official channels." Mr. Somchai studied the documents, his expression neutral. "And the nature of your relationship with Miss Sopa? We lived together, shared expenses, made plans for the future. I thought we were building something permanent. But you were not married?" "No." "Not engaged with formal ceremony?" "No." "No legal documents establishing joint financial responsibility or property ownership?" "No, nothing like that." Mr. Somchai set down his pen and looked at me with the kind of gentle directness that I suspected he'd perfected over years of delivering bad news to hopeful foreigners. "Mr. Morrison, under Thai law, you have no legal claim to any money you voluntarily gave to Miss Sopa or spent on her behalf during your relationship. The rent payments were made voluntarily, the donations were legitimate charitable contributions, and any cash gifts were given without legal obligation for return." I felt my chest tighten with something that wasn't quite surprise, but wasn't relief either. Even though the relationship was based on deception, did she misrepresent her marital status, her identity, her legal right to accept your financial support? No, but she was seeing someone else while accepting my money. Adultery is not illegal in Thailand, and financial support given during a relationship does not become recoverable simply because the relationship ends badly. Mr. Somchai leaned back in his chair, his expression sympathetic but firm. "I understand this is difficult, but the law does not provide remedies for broken hearts or poor judgment in romantic relationships. If you had been married, or if there were children involved, or if she had stolen money or committed fraud, the situation would be different. But voluntary financial support given during a consensual relationship, there is no legal mechanism for recovery. What if I could prove that the relationship was never genuine on her part, that she was only with me for financial benefit? Even if you could prove that, which would be extremely difficult, it would not change the legal reality. Adults are free to enter relationships for any reason they choose, including financial security. As long as there was no criminal deception involved, the motivations of the parties are not legally relevant." I sat there absorbing this information, feeling oddly grateful for its clarity even as it confirmed my worst fears about my situation. No legal recourse meant no recovery of funds, but it also meant no prolonged battle, no opportunity for SOPA to twist the knife further through the court system. There's something else I need to know, I said. The apartment we shared, the rental car I've been paying for, the utility accounts. Am I legally responsible for any ongoing obligations? Mr. Somchai consulted the documents again. The rental agreement is in Miss Sopa's name only? Yes. The car rental agreement? Also in her name. She said it was easier that way because of insurance requirements for foreigners. The utility accounts? Her name again. Mr. Somchai made more notes, and I could see something like approval in his expression. Then you have no ongoing legal obligations whatsoever. Miss Sopa appears to have been quite careful about keeping all official responsibilities in her own name. The irony hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been congratulating myself on trusting Sopa enough to let her handle the practical arrangements, she'd been systematically protecting herself from any legal entanglement with me. Every lease, every contract, every official document had been carefully structured to ensure that I could walk away without consequences, or more accurately, that she could make me walk away without complications. She planned this, I said, more to myself than to Mr. Somchai. Not necessarily. Many Thai people are simply cautious about mixing financial obligations with foreign partners. The legal systems are different. Visa situations can change, and it's generally safer to maintain separate official identities even in committed relationships. But it made it easy for her to do what she did. It made it clean, Mr. Somchai agreed, which suggests either excellent legal advice or considerable experience with international relationships. Experience. There was that word again, the same implication Ploy had made at the NGO office. Sopa had done this before, perfected a system that allowed her to extract maximum financial benefit from relationships while maintaining complete legal independence. She was better at this than I'd given her credit for, more sophisticated in her planning than I'd imagined. Is there anything else I should know? I asked. Any other legal complications I might face? Have you made any threats toward Miss Sopa or her current partner? Any attempts to contact her family or employer with accusations? No, nothing like that. Have you attempted to interfere with her work or social relationships in any way? No. Then my advice is simple. Consider this an expensive lesson in international romance and move on with your life. Thailand has very strict laws about harassment and defamation, and pursuing this matter further could put you at risk of legal troubles that would be far more costly than what you've already lost. I paid Mr. Somchai his consultation fee and walked out into the humid afternoon air, feeling strangely empty. Not devastated, not angry, just hollow in a way that felt almost peaceful. The legal consultation had stripped away my last illusions about having any power in this situation, any ability to fight back or demand justice or even get a meaningful apology. I was exactly where Sopa had positioned me from the beginning. Financially lighter, emotionally damaged, but legally powerless to do anything about it. She'd played the game perfectly, following rules I hadn't even known existed until it was too late to protect myself. My phone buzzed with a text from the hotel. Mr. Morrison, we wanted to confirm your checkout date. Will you be extending your stay? I realized I'd been in Thailand for over a week without making any concrete plans for what came next. Return to England and the depressing process of selling my mother's house? Stay in Thailand and try to rebuild some version of the life I'd thought I was living? Fly somewhere else entirely and start over again from scratch? None of the options felt appealing, but staying in Thailand felt impossible. Every street corner held memories of walks with Sopa. Every restaurant reminded me of meals we'd shared. Every sunset looked like the ones we'd watched together from our balcony. The whole country had become a crime scene where I was both victim and evidence. I walked to a travel agency and inquired about flights back to Manchester. The agent, a cheerful Thai woman about Sopa's age, found several options and quoted prices while I tried not to see similarities in her smile and her careful English pronunciation. Will this be one way or return? She asked. One way, I said, surprising myself with the finality of it. Any specific date or flexible? As soon as possible. She tapped at her computer, frowning slightly. There's a seat available tomorrow evening, but it's quite expensive because of the short notice. Friday would be much cheaper. Tomorrow is fine. I paid for the ticket and walked out with a confirmation email and 36 hours to figure out how to pack up 6 months of my life and find a way to live with what I'd learned about myself in the process. The hotel room felt different when I returned, less like a refuge and more like a waiting room. I started gathering my belongings, the same pathetic collection of clothes and electronics that had followed me from England to Thailand and would now follow me back again. Nothing I was leaving behind had any value. Nothing I was taking with me held any joy. I found myself thinking about Mr. Somchai's words. Consider this an expensive lesson in international romance. £15,000 for 6 months of believing I was loved, working out to about £80 per day for the privilege of being deceived by an expert. There were probably more expensive ways to learn about human nature, but not many. My phone rang. Sopa's number. I stared at it for 4 rings before letting it go to voicemail. Then I listened to her message. Julian, I heard you went to see a lawyer. I just want you to know that I never took anything that wasn't freely given. I never lied about who I was or what I wanted. If you think I owe you something, you're wrong. But if you need to blame someone for what happened, blame me. Just don't blame Thailand. Don't blame all Thai women. Don't let this make you bitter about everything. I played the message 3 times, listening for any trace of remorse or regret, or even concern for how I was handling the aftermath of our relationship. What I heard instead was someone protecting her reputation, making sure I understood that she'd operated within both legal and cultural boundaries, even if she'd crossed every moral line I thought existed. She was right, of course. I had no legal claim to anything, no moral high ground to stand on, no right to feel betrayed by someone who'd never actually promised me more than she'd delivered. She'd been warm and affectionate and generous with her time and attention. She'd never said she loved me exclusively, never promised me a future, never claimed that I was anything more than a chapter in her life. I'd built all those expectations myself, created a narrative about love and commitment, and shared dreams that existed only in my imagination. Sopa had simply allowed me to believe what I needed to believe, for as long as it benefited both of us. The truly bitter irony was that her environmental work was legitimate, her NGO contributions were real, and the coral reef being rebuilt with my money would probably outlast any memory of our relationship. She'd used me, but she'd also used my resources for something genuinely worthwhile. Even my exploitation had been performed with a kind of integrity that I couldn't help but admire. I deleted her voicemail and blocked her number, not out of anger, but out of a recognition that we had nothing left to say to each other. Tomorrow I would fly back to England and begin the long process of figuring out who I was when I wasn't trying to be someone's salvation or refuge or financial security blanket. Tonight, I would order room service and watch the sunset from my anonymous hotel balcony and try to find some peace in the knowledge that I'd loved someone completely, even if that love had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who they were and what they wanted from me. It wasn't the ending I'd hoped for, but it was an ending I could live with. That would have to be enough. My last morning in Thailand began the same way my first had, 8 months earlier, with me sitting alone on a beach, watching the sun rise over the Andaman Sea. But everything else was different now. The hopeful, damaged man who'd arrived looking for a fresh start had been replaced by someone quieter, more careful, less willing to mistake loneliness for love or gratitude for genuine affection. I'd checked out of the hotel at dawn and taken a taxi to Rawai Beach, the same stretch of sand where Sopa had first taught me to identify different types of coral by their colors and shapes. It seemed like a lifetime ago, that afternoon when she'd knelt beside me in the shallow water, pointing out the differences between brain coral and staghorn coral, while I tried to concentrate on marine biology instead of the way the sunlight caught the drops of water on her shoulders. "The reef is dying," she'd said that day, her voice mixing scientific concern with genuine sadness. "Pollution, warming temperatures, careless tourists who break off pieces as souvenirs. In 10 years, there might be nothing left but bleached skeletons. I'd promised to help then, not just with money, but with time and effort and whatever skills I could bring to the conservation work that mattered so much to her. I'd meant it completely, just as I'd meant everything else I'd said to her over the following months. The tragedy wasn't that I'd been insincere, but that my sincerity had been so easy to exploit. The beach was nearly empty at this hour, just a few fishermen preparing their long-tail boats and an elderly Western woman doing Tai Chi near the water's edge. I recognized her from previous mornings, a German expatriate who'd been living in Thailand for 20 years and moved through her exercises with the kind of peaceful precision that suggested she'd found whatever she'd been looking for. "Beautiful morning," she said as she finished her routine and noticed me watching the sunrise. "Yes," I agreed, "though I'm not sure I'll see many more like it." "You're leaving?" "This afternoon." She studied my face with the kind of direct assessment that older expatriates develop after years of watching younger ones arrive full of dreams and leave full of disappointment. "Thailand didn't work out for you?" "Thailand was fine. It was everything else that didn't work out." She nodded with the understanding of someone who'd probably seen this story play out dozens of times. The heart wants what it wants, but it's not always very smart about getting it. "How long have you been here?" I asked. 23 years, came for a 2-week vacation, and never left." She gestured toward a small house visible through the palm trees. "Built a life here, learned the language, made real friends. But I was 65 when I arrived, old enough to know the difference between adventure and desperation." The implication was clear but not unkind. I'd been running from something rather than running toward something, and people who are running from their problems make easy targets for those who know how to exploit emotional vulnerability. "Any advice for someone heading back to reality?" I asked. "Don't let one bad experience poison your memory of a whole country. Thailand didn't hurt you. One person hurt you, and that person could have been from anywhere." She picked up her towel and prepared to leave. "Also, don't waste too much time being angry at yourself for believing in love. That's what hearts are supposed to do." After she left, I sat alone with my thoughts and the growing heat of the tropical morning. My flight didn't leave until evening, which gave me most of the day to figure out how I wanted to remember this chapter of my life. I could focus on the betrayal, the lies, the calculated way Sopa had managed our relationship to maximize her benefits while minimizing her risks. Or I could try to find some other perspective, some way of understanding what had happened that didn't leave me feeling like a complete fool. The truth, I realized, was more complicated than either pure victimhood or pure stupidity. Sopa had used me, but she'd also given me 6 months of feeling needed and valued and alive in ways I'd forgotten were possible. She'd introduced me to a world of environmental activism and cross-cultural relationships that had expanded my understanding of what life could be like outside the narrow boundaries I'd drawn around myself back in England. Yes, she'd been sleeping with another man for the final 3 weeks of our relationship. But for the 5 months before that, her affection had seemed genuine, her interest in my thoughts and experiences had appeared real, and the physical intimacy between us had felt like something more than mere performance. Maybe it was. Maybe some of it, being real, was more than I had any right to expect from someone who'd been managing her own survival in ways I was only beginning to understand. The young German expatriate had been right about one thing. I was old enough to know the difference between adventure and desperation, but I'd chosen to ignore that knowledge because desperation felt more honest than the careful distance that experience teaches. I'd wanted to believe that love could still surprise me, that connection could still overwhelm judgment, that someone could see past my age and my baggage and my limited understanding of their world to find something worth treasuring. In a way, that had happened. Sopa had seen past my surface characteristics to something deeper. My loneliness, my financial resources, my desire to feel useful and appreciated. She'd recognized exactly what I needed and figured out how to provide it in a way that also met her own needs. That took skill, intelligence, and a kind of emotional sophistication that I had to respect, even as I recognized how thoroughly it had been used against me. My phone buzzed with a message from the taxi company, confirming pickup time for the airport, 4 hours until departure. 4 hours. To say goodbye to the version of myself that had believed in tropical love stories and second chances, and the possibility of building something permanent with someone from a completely different world. I walked along the shoreline, letting the warm water lap at my feet while I tried to imagine what came next. Return to England, sell my mother's house, figure out how to live alone again without the daily structure that caring for someone else provides. The thought was depressing but not terrifying. I'd been alone before, after my divorce, and I'd survived it. I could survive it again, older and hopefully wiser, about the difference between love and neediness, between partnership and exploitation. A group of Thai children ran past me, chasing a soccer ball that bounced erratically in the sand. They were laughing and shouting in the unself-conscious way that only children can manage, completely absorbed in their game and oblivious to the foreign man watching them with what probably looked like melancholy. One of the boys kicked the ball in my direction and I kicked it back, earning a grin and a quick, "Thank you, mister," before he rejoined his friends. Such a simple interaction, free of agenda or expectation or hidden meaning. The kind of genuine human connection that I'd thought I was building with SOPA, but that had been layered with complications I'd never fully understood. Maybe that was what I needed to look for going forward. Simplicity, honesty, relationships that didn't require me to be anyone other than who I actually was. The taxi arrived exactly on time, and I took one last look at Rawai Beach before climbing into the air-conditioned interior. The driver was the same man who'd brought me here 8 months earlier, though he didn't seem to recognize me. Why would he? I was just another middle-aged Western man in a steady stream of middle-aged Western men, some arriving full of hope, others leaving full of hard-earned wisdom. "Airport?" he asked in English. "Airport," I confirmed. As we drove through Phuket town, past the temples and markets and coffee shops where Soap and I had spent so many afternoons, I found myself thinking not about what I'd lost, but about what I'd learned. About the difference between being needed and being loved. About the way financial generosity can become a substitute for emotional intimacy. About the importance of maintaining some part of yourself that isn't given away to another person, no matter how much you care about them. The airport was busy with the usual mix of sunburned tourists and business travelers, people beginning adventures and people ending them. I checked in for my flight and found a quiet corner to wait, watching the planes take off and land while I tried to process everything that had happened since I'd made the impulsive decision to book a ticket back to Thailand. A young couple sat across from me, clearly at the beginning of their relationship based on the way they couldn't stop touching each other and whispering private jokes that made them both laugh. They looked happy, unself-conscious, secure in whatever they'd found together. I watched them without envy or bitterness, just a kind of distant recognition of emotions I'd felt not long ago. Maybe their love would last, maybe it wouldn't. Maybe they'd build something real together. Maybe one of them was already thinking about exit strategies. It didn't matter. What mattered was that they were willing to risk disappointment for the chance of finding something genuine, willing to be vulnerable enough to get hurt for the possibility of not getting hurt. I'd taken that risk and lost, but I didn't regret taking it. The alternative was the careful, protected life I'd been living after my divorce, where loneliness was safe because it couldn't be exploited, and where cynicism protected me from making the kind of mistakes that led to growth and self-knowledge. My flight was called, and I joined the queue of passengers shuffling toward the gate. As the plane lifted off, I pressed my face to the window and watched Thailand disappear beneath the clouds, the green islands and blue water becoming abstract patterns that looked beautiful from a distance. Somewhere down there, Sopa was probably getting on with her life, working on her coral restoration projects and building whatever future she'd planned with Niren. I hoped it would make her happy. I hoped she'd find the security and love she'd been looking for in ways that didn't require deceiving lonely middle-aged men. But mostly, I hoped I'd learned enough from loving her to do better next time. Because there would be a next time, eventually. Not soon, and not with the same desperate need for validation that had made me such an easy target. But someday, when the sting of this experience had faded into wisdom rather than pain, I'd be ready to risk my heart again. The plane banked toward Europe, and I settled back in my seat, closing my eyes and letting myself remember not the lies and betrayals, but the genuine moments of connection that had made the lies possible. Sopa laughing at my terrible pronunciation of Thai words, the weight of her head on my shoulder during evening movies, the way she looked at me sometimes when she thought I wasn't watching, with an expression that might have been fondness or might have been calculation, but it felt like love at the time. Some of it had been real. That would have to be enough to build on, enough to convince me that love was still worth risking even when the risks were higher than I'd understood. The coral reef my money had helped restore would outlast both our relationship and our memory of it, providing shelter for fish and beauty for divers long after we'd both forgotten each other's names. That seemed like a reasonable return on investment for a heart that had been broken but not destroyed, for a man who'd learned the difference between being used and being loved but hadn't lost his capacity for either. I was flying back to England alone, but I wasn't going back empty-handed. I was carrying lessons that hurt, but that I wouldn't trade for the safer ignorance I'd possessed before I met her. The plane climbed higher into the darkening sky, carrying me away from Thailand and toward whatever came next. I didn't know what that would be, but for the first time in weeks, I was curious rather than afraid to find out.